Thank you guys for joining. This is a composition webinar. So we are going to get started June 19th. We're having another webinar. So Josh Russell, also with Paul Gestalt. We're talking about raw conversion. So it's a conversation between three people, three photographers we've been shooting for many years. Josh Russell is a portrait photographer, and Paul Gestalt is a landscape photographer, and I'm a macro studio photographer. So I have a different workflow. Josh has a different one. So does Paul. We're going to be talking about Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom and Capture One. So if you want to know how to get the most out of your raw, then I suggest you sign up. Just go to mckennapro.com/coaching, just where you signed up for this webinar. Then you'll be able to sign up for that one. So that is June 19th. So that should be pretty awesome. And just be checking if you sign up for the, subscribe to these channels, you'll be able to know when we have new webinars. So again, they're absolutely free to you guys. So, all right. You should be able to see my screen. All right, so creating captivating composition. This is what we're going to talk about here. So these, all of these things. So rule of thirds, we'll get into that. Mood lines, golden spirals, triangles and shapes, perspective, symmetry, hats and hands, basically using accessories, cropping, real estate, leading lines, horizon lines, Gestalt principles, foreground and background. So all of those things we're going to get through. Okay, so rules of thirds, right? This is the most basic principle. I remember studying at Brooks. First class was design. They taught us you need to understand diagonal lines, and the rule of thirds is really crucial in that sense. And the reason why is because you can basically create certain rules for your own photography. Obviously, the light matters, the color matters, the color of complementary colors and how they relate to each other, but also just the elements in your photo. So if you look at the right and you compare it to the left, basically I drew two vertical lines and two horizontal lines, and that splits it up into 3 columns and 3 rows. And where those 4 lines intersect, that creates diagonal lines, right? So you can place objects there. Obviously, you can break the rules and do certain things with light, with bokeh, with color. What's important in your photo. You determine what's important, and you do that through different means, like those just mentioned. Basically, I think just in general composition, it's learn the rules so then you can take advantage of them. So then you'll know how to break them, right? Because photography isn't about just diagonal lines and rules of thirds, right? So basically it's understanding how to see these 4 lines in your own mind's eye so that when you don't have the grid, then you're able to literally just see the image and okay, roughly that's a third, or you want to change something and create a diagonal line, or you want to use a certain principle of that. So I created this, and this is just through Photoshop. I think, let's see, this is the rulers. So I just created this with guides like this, and then just did equal parts. And then I took a screenshot. I made them black and white. I painted it basically black. And I could use this format, and the rule of thirds applies to any ratio, right? It's 9/16, it's 3/4, it's 1:1, it's 2:3, it's 4:5, 5:4, whatever you want. It's always going to be these 4 intersecting lines, and then to create some diagonal lines with that, okay? Just think about placing strategic elements in your photo to create certain diagonal lines. Right, and you can see that here. And some, it's suggested, just like the ball is over here and maybe the boy's head is here. So you kind of get this diagonal line here, his shoulder and where he's looking, and these other kids over here, right? So you can basically just understand it for yourself. This guy's kind of doing a hand plant, and one of his feet is there, right? You have opposite hands and feet, so that's creating an interesting composition. And even just topographical on the top left one, where you have certain elements creating diagonal lines. And even though they're not necessarily in that specific intersection, it's still in the vicinity, which definitely can help. Okay, so that is rule of thirds. Let me just get rid of these. Any questions so far? We're going to talk about some triangles here. All right, so let me just get to my little. All right, so if we bring up this image, I basically, this is the same thing. This is color, this is black and white, and I drew some triangles on the black and white because it's easier to see in black and white than it was in color, and creating some red triangles. So I just kind of drew these. So just glance over these while I talk. Okay, so we're going to talk about leading lines. We're going to talk about foreground and background and how they relate. So top left, look at these leading lines created from a triangle. There's no direct line in here like there is maybe in the baseball, which is the one over, or the football field, which is the one over to the right on going along the top row. And you have your yoga kind of whatever this pose is, triangle lines with the reflection and the knees. And this, her hands are creating a diagonal line. Also, just in a sense, symmetry. We'll talk about symmetry, and the symmetry creating a triangle. And if we come over here to the left, this hand and negative space of this as well, with this next runner following along from the left. I'm just going basically as we read, right? Top left to top right, and hopefully you can see my cursor here. So this one, right, you're getting this diagonal line like this, and her shape is, you have 3 or 4 different triangles here. And all of these shapes, it's either through hand gestures or just real lines like in the tennis all the way to the right in the second row, or this hand gesture as well, or the dress and how it creates that. Even in the clouds, I'm drawing triangles. So constantly when I shoot, I'm envisioning triangles. I'm keeping in mind the rule of thirds. I'm thinking about color and complementary colors. Remember, blue is the opposite of yellow, magenta is the opposite of green, and red is the opposite of cyan. So use those to your advantage. Right? When we come over here, you can sense that there is some play with color, right? You have the oranges and the blues, you have the purples and the yellow-green tennis balls with the sort of red, oranges, clay colored tennis court. And this image here of the flowers with this girl, and purple flowers with green leaves, right? And this is almost like the magenta and green. And we can literally just see triangles all throughout. We don't have to draw them, but just think of these triangles. Like if this one in the fields, if I just zoom in here, right, you can see these triangles with her arms. You can see these triangles with his arms. You can see this dominant shape here. And if I just pull up, I could probably just draw on this. Right, if I just pull up, you can see these diagonal lines. You can see this diagonal line, right? And diagonal lines form triangles, right? And I basically did all this in this, so and maybe it's a better drawing and better way to see it here. But you have the clouds over here, and you have all of these triangles. Maybe you didn't notice these triangles with the flowers, but once you start picking it apart, you can kind of separate shapes, whether it's within the neck, whether it's the lips, the shoulders, even our noses, frontal, they're triangles. And this woman here, right here, I'm looking at this one. There's a beautiful triangle right here. Even the glass, the wine glass. So all of these shapes are just something to keep in mind, so that whether you're shooting in black and white or you're in color, you're able to see some powerful diagonal shapes. And triangles, as we know, like the pyramids, incredibly structural forms. Any questions so far on triangles? Whenever you're shooting, it's so important just to think about all of these concepts because you never know what is going to happen in front of your eyes. If you're shooting sports and someone moves through your frame, you might not have, rules of thirds and diagonal lines and all this kind of thing like at first thought. But as you go along, it's going to really help you if you can pull from the knowledge that you have. And that's just years of practice. The more you have that, the easier you'll be able to access that kind of thing. Okay, these are the Gestalt principles. So Gestalt basically translates to form. Okay, so it's not like a person named Gestalt came up with it. It's basically a psychological understanding of how the mind categorizes images. Okay, so there's 7 different ones. I'm only going to mention a few. So I'm going to start with figure and ground. Okay, so like I said, the mind categorizes images based on whether they are in the foreground or background. There's a classic one, Rubens' vase. It's a classic example of 2 faces facing each other, their profiles, and the negative space in between the faces actually shows a vase. So what do you see first? And this is this classic example of, is it figure or is it ground? And I studied painting back in the day, so we talked a lot about figure and ground. And it's really helpful in photography if you think about this, because we can direct our attention to the foreground and leave the background behind. But when we pay attention to the background, we see the full picture. So this is just an example of that. So when you see the background, you see the full picture, right? When you pay attention to the foreground, you leave the background behind. Okay, so these are just 2 examples of that. Okay, so proximity. This is when dealing with 2 different elements, how do they relate to each other, right? So we can perceive images differently based on the proximity of the elements, right? Their noses are touching, their foreheads are touching, their hands are on each other. We know they're a couple, right? This is an intimate moment for just them, right? And the photographer, obviously. But it's an intimate moment, right? Captured. And it happens a lot with babies, with couples, with families. So just think about how that relates, and whether it's, a still life of tennis rackets and balls, or maybe wedding rings and, a dress, or maybe, some other elements. Where are they in proximity to each other? Okay. So closure, this is an example of closure. So I want you can close your eyes if you'd like, if that helps. So imagine for a second you see a soccer ball and all the whites are blown out, right? You can still see those black shapes and you still know that it's a soccer ball. You don't have to see the roundness of the white and how it's brighter and it's spherical and that kind of thing. It's a soccer ball. So we use this principle with all other elements because our mind wants to perceive the elements as a whole, right? So rather than the sum of its parts, we can literally suggest things. And I think this image is a good example because we know that's a hat. We know what hats look like, especially this kind of hat. We know that she's wearing a glove. We know this is her hand, or we maybe hope it is, but we know that glove came from her, right? It shows that her, right shoulder is down, and you could just imagine how her arm comes down and her hand comes up. You can tell that's her right hand. And the little tiny suggestion along the bottom is a dress, right? Because if it didn't have that little sliver of black on the bottom, it would change the mood of the photo, right? It would change everything. So do we need to show the whole entire hat? Do we need to show the entire arm? Do we need to show the entire dress? No. So this is closure, and this is different elements suggesting the whole, okay? So this is another principle. Symmetry, there's a few examples here. Right, so our minds group things together and we look for symmetry. We are actually symmetrical, and studies have been shown that people are more attractive the more symmetrical they are. And for whatever reason, we look for symmetry, right? So there's one classic example of the bike wheel and a manhole cover, and you could probably Google that too. So that is, that they're round. So you're looking to associate these shapes, and then you're like, oh, they're two circles. So this creates a conjunction and some sort of symmetry. So in photography like this, you can, like if we go top left down to bottom right, you can kind of see how symmetry plays. Now, the two people obviously don't have to be facing the same direction. If you're topographical, this is a really cute shot. And the next one over a football field, you can see how it's basically symmetrical. It looks like a mirrored image almost. Even the sky does, and it has a nice vignette on it. You can tell that it's, 50-yard line, just straight down the 50-yard line. And this is perfect symmetry, right? And as well with maybe an athlete, the third one and then the fourth one, second row on the left, right? You can add that symmetry. So how do you light that? That matters, right? So the light on the bodybuilder is coming from his left-hand side, and it's creating shadow. Now we can talk about lighting and whether it's one light, two lights, three lights, four lights, whatever. But when it comes down to lighting, really think about, what do you want to convey? Because having one light is a really powerful way to create drama, because you're not going to have fills and all that kind of thing. And a frontal position like this is going to be really strong. And to remember our triangles, look at his arms and look at that triangle that's created, super strong, right? Doing a deadlift or clean or whatever he's about to do, right? So, and then symmetry with the married couple, just nicely centered, beautiful image. Even this little foot, maybe it's a man or a female, maybe it's her own feet, just dressed differently. Who knows? Whatever it is, it's kind of cool. So you have, it's asymmetrical, but at the same time, there's a lot of symmetry in it. And bottom left, her hands create symmetry. Her arms create that. And we'll talk more about arms and how when they go up, they create triangles. So, and we'll talk about hats as well. And then this image of both hands, so super cute with the babies. And also on the bottom right, two trees flanking this person in the middle. Even though the light is directional, she's somewhat in the middle, but think about rule of thirds. Think about diagonal lines, think about leading lines, right? That light piercing through those trees is creating, these diagonal lines and the leading lines to her. So our attention will always go to the brightest spot of the photo. That's one key thing to remember. Always to the brightest spot. So if you don't want your eye to go to the brightest spot, tone down that white or yellow or whatever color it is, right? Just tone that down or crop it out or, do something. This is in reference to Gestalt principles. So symmetry, closure, proximity, and figure ground. Any questions so far?
Yeah, Eric, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
The previous photo, the couple with the nose touching.
Sure.
Yeah. When is it okay to chop off the top of somebody's head? Because I see that in some.
Yeah. I think, use your best judgment on that. And here's something to consider. If the top of the head isn't helping, then it's hurting. We could look at maybe all of these, and his is cut off. You could probably even cut off her, but then you might lose the neckline. So maybe that's why they didn't. This is perfectly fine. I maybe would have had a little more. It really depends on, when you do crop into something, you're going to bring that thing closer, whether it's a flower, a tree, an arm, a hand, right? So, they could have had more wrist. It's best to not cut at joints. So not at elbows, not at wrists, I'd say, but this is maybe the exception of the rule. And if, you're creating so much emphasis right here with the thumb and the whole entire hand that you forget about the wrist. And maybe if you had more wrist, it would take away the importance of what's happening at the top 2/3 of the image. So I think honestly, it's really up to you, and I do that a lot. I feel like cropping the top of the head is perfectly fine, but I always do my cropping at the very end of all of my Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever I'm in, like always at the very end, so I have the image. But if you want to make an executive decision while you shoot, then I think that's great. So you just have to stick to the principles. And I think that the more experience you get with shooting, then you'll just be like, I'm chopping off the top of the head and it's going to be better. And you know it's better, and you just make that executive decision in the camera. So it really depends if it's helping or hurting, honestly, is the short answer. Like this, you know, I wouldn't have cropped right at that edge line here. I probably would have given just a tad bit more, but since there's not as much hat, it brings you right to this eye, and this diagonal line right here is just perfectly framing that eye. We're going to talk about hats. We're going to talk about cropping. We're going to talk about real estate and hands. Okay, so let's think about this. Some of these hats are cropped, and you have to think, is the top of the hat necessary? And like we said, if it's not helping, it's hurting, right? So think about the backs of the hats. Is the back of a hat more interesting than the back of the head? Maybe in some cases, maybe not in others. I kind of would say probably in more cases it is, but it really depends. So what if it's a bad hair day? Well, throw a hat on it. What if it's really windy? Throw a hat on it. What if you don't have a hairstylist? Put a hat, right? So hats can be a lot more interesting based on the angle that you display them, right? So whether it's a ball cap like this guy, or he's got like maybe a top hat, or she's wearing a hat and he's not, or you're covering his face and you have like a one light thing and you're getting shade on his face, or the majority of her hat is covering her face and the important thing goes to this like Kindle nook or whatever this is. Or, you know, is it backlit and the hat is actually helping your lighting? Maybe it's completely from the back and the hat is a complementary color to the background. Maybe the hat, you know, creates a mood, a really nice mood, because without this hat, it's, you know, it's not all that, right? And hand gestures, let's talk about some hands for a sec, right? So, well, back to the hat, the size of the hat, that's your call, right? And so hands, get them if they are uncomfortable. Hats are a great prop for them to start playing with it and start feeling comfortable. And it's like we've all kind of grabbed the hat, took it off, put it back on, and then it becomes something that they're comfortable with. It's something familiar for them. It's something that to get them out of their head. And it's also creating triangles and diagonal lines with the hands. So, you know, in this one right here, this purple one in the middle, if you can see my cursor, she is holding something, whether it's an umbrella, whether it's a wine bottle, whether it's champagne or Prosecco or anything, it's still something that's an element, right? And this one over here, she's holding a book, right? This one, she's holding a hat. These are holding hands, right? So down here, if you can see that, these guys are holding hands. So hands are also around each other. And hands can be, you know, whether it's a magnifying glass prop like this guy, or, you know, like her just suggestive touching kind of thing. Maybe the baby has hands on a rail. And I think there was another one. Well, that's somewhat symmetrical. And like I said, this was symmetry over here. And our hands together and she's just smiling. I mean, that's nice. Hands touching face, right? I mean, I'm basically stating the obvious. And we know all of these things, but we forget them in the moment when we're shooting and we're nervous, and maybe they're nervous and they're anxious. Well, a lot of times we can just suggest, you're like, oh, like I know something that will definitely help the strength of this image, and it's going to create a diagonal line, and it's going to create a triangle. Let's get an object, whatever it is. Or let's get another person and let's have them interact, whatever it is. Maybe it's glasses, take your glasses off, put them next to you, that kind of thing, right? So whenever hands are touching something, it looks a little more natural instead of just posing, right? So think about the hands, and also think about the color. Really, you know, when you lead the hands to somewhere, what color is on the other end? Are you just like the magnifying glass, just using the hand to hold something to bring attention to something else? Or like top right, it's a cigarette or a cigar, and you know, maybe that smoke is creating a little more mood. Not in this photo, but maybe you could. right? So all of those hands, that hand gesture. And so just think about color and light. Okay, so foregrounds, backgrounds, and real estate, right? So when you crop, and probably the best example is this image here, right? So without all of that environmental space, I don't feel that this portrait is as successful. Someone asks, how do you eliminate face shadows on a hat? Well, you can do it in Photoshop. It's tricky, but I would say just light it better and just think about that directional light. And that's just with experience. So fills, bounce cards, reflective surfaces, whether it's white cards or mirrors or all that kind of thing. But you'll see in the majority, and I'm just kind of going on sidetrack, but think about the light where this was shot. So I find that overcast days are really nice to shoot. Plus, if your camera doesn't have a high dynamic range, it'll help if you're shooting in that less contrasty light. So it's, the bottom left, like this whole bottom row is more overcast, even while the next row up, this is a little more sunny. I'm talking about this one here. So you're not going to get those harsh shadows, but yeah, just something to think about. Think about filling that. And directional light, if you're using a flash, just a bare head and not a softbox or something, you're going to get a harsher light. So, and then the direction of light will matter too. I don't think upward shadows from the nose being cast up towards the eyes, I don't think those are good looking shadows. I would rather have them down because that's the natural shape or look of the sun, right? So yeah, so real estate, right? So what is the cropping? What's the real estate in your photo? Like if we look at this one here, right? Just, we can talk about rule of thirds, we can talk about complementary colors, we can talk about mood lines, which we're going to get into in a bit. And the negative space, all of this other space over here is just not being used, but it's creating a mood. So can you make it square? Sure, you can square it up. And there's a square maybe right here. And then there's your square, right? Or if you want to move it off to the side. But honestly, I think it's more successful by getting this stream right here. And it's kind of creating a somewhat of a slant diagonal line. But, and as we said, this photo here, if you crop in, now I wouldn't crop necessarily at the elbow joint, and I wouldn't crop necessarily at the hairline. I'd maybe be a little more drastic or give it a little more space. But nevertheless, when you crop so tightly, it just brings you so much closer to your subject. And like this guy with the eye, right? Just cropping right here, it's just so much better. But think about, I think this is tension, like this spot right here. I wouldn't necessarily crop it right there because it creates some tension right at the edge. I would rather have some space like in this one over here and have some space between his collar and end of the frame. But, and then maybe there's some space over here, but maybe, cropping this area like this, then it brings you into, the iPad or whatever this is, right? So just think about real estate in your photo. And this one's a kind of classic example of how to use some diagonal lines, how to use some hair, how to use some cropping, how to create the shoulders at an angle. And all of this is negative space, all of that, right? There's really just hair and sky and grass. But that's, 55, 60% of the real estate. So just keep in the back of your mind, like when you're shooting sports people or something, where are they moving in the frame? Are they moving towards the right? Because we read left to right. Are they moving towards the left? And what does that create? Are they moving up and down and all that kind of thing? So that in a sense, that's hands, hats, accessories, cropping, and real estate. And the last one is this one, right? We didn't really touch on that, but that's the mood that we're creating, right? And I'm kind of repeating myself, but all of that, it's almost 40% of the entire real estate is just empty. And that's the feel they're going for. Very calming. It's nice. Okay, any questions so far? All right, so we have this image and I believe these two images. Okay, so horizontal lines, and then we have perspective. Okay, so horizontal line. Look at these and how they differ. 3 rows are similar and 2 rows except for one image is similar. So I'll make it easy on you and say, oh, I actually have these image, I have one image twice, so my bad on that. This top image is repeated in here. Okay, so these first, actually, let me do this. These first 3 lines, these top lines, what is in common with these 3 lines? Harley says, notice also that in the best images that display hands, the back of the hands typically face the camera. For a softer image, thumbs may drag eye directly to themselves. Yes, that is very true in some cases, but it really depends on the hands. You get some burly men or you get some very soft babies. And you get gestures of, you know, aggression, or you get like a you know, like a very sweet touching hand. So, you know, again, it's how to understand the rules and how to interpret that, but then make them your own and kind of break it. So I don't think in photography it's like an all or nothing. That's kind of what I would say. It's sometimes yes, sometimes no. It really depends on everything else. But that is good feedback. So thank you. What do the 3 rows, top rows, have in common? Horizon lines. Okay, thank you, Sandra. So horizon lines, right? So how much sky is best? Is the sky important? Well, it depends on the sky that you have. If it's just gray and drab, maybe it's better in a black and white. Maybe you have some really cool clouds. Maybe you have an awesome sunset and the light's really warm. Maybe the foreground is more interesting, right? Like look at the tennis racket, second row, far right, or the one above it on the field of wheat or whatever this is. I'm not a farmer, so I have no idea. But maybe that's hopefully I'm right. I don't know. Or the sprinter right here, right? This sprinter, whoops, this sprinter right there. Right. So look at that foreground. The majority of the photo is foreground. Right. And you kind of have a suggested horizon line here. It's kind of like right around here. Right. You can kind of tell that this line right in here is the foreground. And maybe it doesn't have that exact foreground like all of these do. And obviously I'm just trying to prove a point. Here's the horizon line, here's the horizon line, here's the horizon line, right? So you can get a feel, even this doesn't have a horizon line, but it's suggested that there's somewhat of a foreground and a background, which creates a horizon line. And I know we've talked about horizon lines before, and this is the most obvious, maybe horizon line. You know, you have literally where the sky meets the ground, but nevertheless, if you're inside, well, where does that wall meet the floor? Now look, except for this one, and I could probably just get rid of that one. Look at the bottom row, right? These don't have a horizon line, right? And again, if it's not helping, it's hurting. So if your sky is boring and drab and of no interest, well, change your perspective, right? Change your perspective, get rid of that horizon line and start using other elements that are more important. How much foreground is best, how much background is best, it really depends on everything, honestly. So think about the perspective, right? So in the top 2, going from, you know, these 2 images here, right? Those 2 are top down, and the shadow is somewhat of a leading line. Whether it leads away from her or towards her, it's your call. But it's more topographical. This one is particularly more topographical than that one, but he's sitting down, so you don't have to get so high. This one is more sort of almost eye level. This one over here. And nice leading lines, and we're going to talk about the golden spiral in a sec. And these two, nice low perspective, lots of sky, very little foreground, diagonal lines, got the hands making triangles, rule of thirds, all that great stuff, right? Leading lines, the whole deal. So what's important to you? Just think about all these things and pull out all the stops. When you're shooting someone, don't just stand, put your camera on a tripod. Don't just stand there. The majority of, and I have to say this, like in all of my people shoots throughout my career as a fashion photographer, as a portrait photographer, almost always, unless the art director was there and said, you know, shoot it this way, but almost always I was on the ground at some point in the shoot. I was literally, it didn't matter where, I didn't care. I'm in a bed of who knows what, or I'm on the street in New York City. Doesn't matter. Like the shot is, you got to get that shot. So where is it? So wide angle lenses are your friend when it comes to perspective. Because a lot of these aren't wide angle, but whereas the baseball guy, this is wide angle, this is wide angle, you know, this can be wide angle. You know, there's so many, just think about lens choices when you do this kind of thing, right? Because these, the majority, well, except for maybe this one, even that's probably still wide. They're all wide angle, wider, some wider than the others, right? So anyway, that's perspective, that's for rides and lines. Any questions there? These are mood lines. When thinking about different elements in your photos, or even structurally, whether it's buildings, right? Like, let's go just through these a little bit. So solid, think about buildings. I brought up New York City. So wide angle, you're shooting someone, but maybe their stance, maybe their gesture, maybe their position, maybe their pose is more like the buildings in New York. Maybe the pose is with more movement, more like this, more dynamic in a solid background. So just think about how these mood lines, and these mood lines can improve or hinder a photo. What's the mood that you want to convey, right? Remember our yoga poses, and they were on the beach. Well, very passive. Remember the book, and I talked about 40% of the empty frame reading the book, and she was in the chair, and the rest is just like empty sort of seascape. Well, that's passive. You know, the flow. What does a flow look like? You know, the hair of the woman that occupied the rest of the frame. That's the flow. So do you want flow? Do you want diagonal lines? And if you do want diagonal lines, a positive curve is going up, right? Like this, or a negative curve is going down, right? Imagine you have the X and Y coordinates, right? Your 1, 2, 3, 4, remember quadrants and geometry, I guess, maybe it was, I don't know. That was a long time ago, but you have those quadrants, and this is a positive slope, that is a negative slope, right? If we come up here to upward and downward, right? You have different things moving in different ways. So are you shooting water? Maybe you're shooting another athlete. Maybe you're shooting someone riding a horse or riding a motorcycle or high jumping or posing. Is it, you know, how do these things relate to your photo? So just think about these things, right? Sturdiness, unsturdy. Think of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You know, you have your greater than, less than, right? More or less. So what's being bigger or smaller? Think perspective, right? And then maybe hands coming together, right? On the right, you have together and you have apart. Are they breaking apart? Are you creating space with the movement? Are you bringing people together with the movement? Main thing is just like language. Be concise, be clear, and ask questions. It's very key. So ask questions to yourself in your head while you're thinking about, oh, you know, 11 and, 1/60th. Think about, what mood do I want to convey? And this kind of thing helps to be concise, be clear. So ask yourself questions while you're doing this. Okay. Any questions? All right. Okay, leading lines. Leading lines is very key in photography, as we know, because those leading lines are really going to bring attention to certain things. Now I'm kind of wrapping it up with this because think about the rule of thirds, think about those mood lines, think about the triangles, think about the color, think about the bokeh, the shapes, right? And let's talk about bokeh just for a sec. This one, you could have gotten this whole pole in focus if you really wanted to. But you know what? It's so much better that this isn't in focus and this isn't in focus either, right? It's so much better. Why? Because you bring the attention right here. And that's what is important. So why would you not have that, right? And same thing with this bokeh on this one, right? All of these lines right here lead us to her, and the background does not distract from her. Sure, you could shoot at f11, adjust your lights and that kind of thing, but maybe it's much prettier to shoot at f4. So think about that when you're doing this, right? Because it's just so much more important when it comes to bringing attention to a certain object. Like this is so wide angle, it really doesn't matter, right? And this is so far in the background, this whole light thing is so far in the background that it really doesn't matter. And when it comes to, you want these faces to be in focus. So use an f-stop enough, sorry, I forgot a couple of faces up here, to get these faces. And who cares about the hands or their, the shorts and that kind of thing. But where's the importance? Create symmetry, right? These leading lines here actually create a triangle. And it goes pretty much to this area right there, right? So all of these leading lines lead us to here, right? This is our shot. But we needed these lines to lead us here. And this one is probably the most classic example here, right? You have, look at these triangles. Look at that shape, right? All of it. And this is like converging lines. And if you've ever taken a two-dimensional drawing class, you know this. You basically put a point here, you get a ruler, and you just start making all these lines, and then you can start drawing buildings. And everything will be in perspective. I could teach you that if you wanted to, but your camera does that automatically. It's just all going to be perspective. So all of these buildings, if this is our spot, all of these lines are all going to be in line, right? So, and same here, this, according to that, there's your horizon. It all creates triangles. So think about these leading lines right here, right? This leads us right to her, right? And so does this one right here. This leads us right to her, and this leads us right there. And where's the focus? On her hand, on her eye. It's perfect. Look at these leading lines of the hand. Perfect. Guess what shape that is, right? Leading lines of here of the guy resting, right here, create all these shapes over here. Create more diagonals here, right? So you're leading, he's resting, right? And he's looking down that way. So think about all this. Look at all these leading lines, right? I'm kind of getting redundant, but you get the idea, right? Even the selfie, it leads us directly to them, right? So basically, I mean, there's so many different elements, whether it's color, whether it's bokeh, whether it's the mood lines, the rule of thirds, the triangles, the leading lines, the color, the light, the symmetry, the proximity, right? There's just the horizon lines, the perspective, the hats, the hands, I mean, the closure. I mean, there's so many things that go into making a photo. And really what it comes down to is, what are you trying to convey? Do your decisions make your image better or worse? Go back through maybe some of your photos and see, did I create good composition? Can I crop better in camera? I'm a very slow photographer and I don't shoot 500 million shots. I go home with a few. And I take time to compose because I don't want to go through a million photos. But I also want to really think about all these things to compose, because later in the cropping, if I see it already cropped, then it spurs another thought. If it's not cropped and I have to do that crop later, then the mood that I wanted to create might be a lot different than what I actually created. So if I crop in camera, I prefer doing that. Plus, you're going to get more out of your sensor. So just think about that. What's necessary, what isn't necessary. Do what you feel is the right thing for the specific customer, or for you, for your family, or whoever you're photographing. So one last thing. Awesome thing. All right, golden spiral. So the Fibonacci sequence was developed, I believe, by a guy named Fibonacci. He was a mathematician in Italy. It's named after him. And basically it's what is it? It's the sum of the two preceding numbers equals the third. So it goes, I believe, 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55. Right? I used to make paintings based on this. And the spiral in this is found in the solar system. I believe it's even found in the vestibular system of the body, and also in the shell in the sea. Right. So what it is if you do 1 times 1, you get a square. If 2 times 2, you get a bigger square. 3 times 3, bigger square. 5 times 5, bigger square. 8 times 8, 13 times 13, 21 times 21, 34 times 34, that kind of thing. What ends up happening is you get this spiral. And why is that important? So I'm going to just bring up a couple things. So I created this. So this image I chose, and you can see the shape of the ear. If I turn this one off, you can see those little spirals in the shape of the ear. I just kind of threw that in there. But you can see that even though you have the symmetry, you have this nice curve. Look at this wine, and if I throw this graphic on top of it, look at that spiral, how that happens, right? So this is called the golden spiral. It's also developed from the Fibonacci sequence. And I think there's one last one, which is here, and I kind of drew 2 of them on there. So, right, you see these lines, you see this shape, right? And it doesn't have to be the entire crop. It's just think about this shape as you combine the arms, combine whatever elements are in there, right? And if I turn that one on and turn that one off, you can see another shape, right? And she's just kind of wrapped up in a little ball, but you have this kind of flowy shape, and think about mood lines and the flow, and think about this golden spiral. So anyway, you can check it out, Fibonacci. That is the golden spiral. So just have that in mind when you're creating movement. I'll stop the share.
Eric, did you see my question in the chat?
Oh, my bad. Yeah, is there a tool in Photoshop? Yes, and I can show you that. And that's kind of how I created that. Yeah. Okay, so let's say if you didn't have these rules of thirds and you got rid of your guides and you were in the crop and you wanted the spiral and you wanted to take a screenshot, then just put it on a white background and literally take a screenshot of that, and then you can rotate it any way you want, right? You can do this and then import it as a layer into another photo, change the blend mode, change the opacity, transform this shape. You can flip it horizontal, flip it vertical. You can put this anywhere you want, transform large, small, whatever you want. And then you'll have it. So if you want to do that, I mean, I could certainly help you create all of these different files if you would like me to. So, but yeah, once you have this, you certainly can. Okay. That, in essence, is today's class on composition. So let me stop the share. Well, if there are no further questions, thank you guys. Thank you so much for joining once again. We appreciate it. Hopefully this was educational, beneficial, and helpful. And if there's anything to just remember, it's everything. And if you guys need any help, and I don't mean that in a overwhelming kind of way, but use different elements and play with different elements so that each element can strengthen the next element. Keep all of those in the back of your head as you're doing the math with the shutter speeds and the ISOs and the f-stops. But yeah, and again, anything I could do to help you guys, just feel free to reach out, mckennapro.com/coaching and sign up, and we'll meet on Zoom. Okay, thank you guys. Have a good one.